My sister told my parents I dropped out of medical school, a lie that got me cut off for 5 years. They did not attend my graduation or my wedding. Last month, my sister was rushed to the emergency room. When her attending physician walked in, my mom grabbed Dad's arm so hard it left bruises. My name is Penelope, though everyone calls me Penny, and I am 34 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat in your own family, while the golden child got away with everything and destroyed your life just for fun. 5 years ago, I was 29 and exhausted in the best way possible. I had just matched into a highly competitive general surgery residency program. It was the culmination of endless sleepless nights, brutal exams, and 80-hour work weeks where I practically lived in the hospital library. To celebrate my parents, Frank and Diane insisted on taking me and my younger sister Bridget to an upscale steakhouse in downtown Boston. The restaurant was a fortress of mahogany and crystal chandeliers, the kind of place where men in tailored suits discussed stock portfolios over aged scotch. I thought for one brief and foolish moment that my parents were actually proud of me. I thought my grueling dedication had finally earned their respect. I was sitting there wearing a simple dress I had bought on clearance, sipping sparkling water, and smiling completely unaware that a trap had already been set. Bridget sat across from me, swirling her expensive wine, wearing a designer dress my parents had bought her for absolutely no reason. She was 31 now, but she still lived off our parents' credit cards, bouncing from one fake career path to another. She was their golden child, beautiful, manipulative, and deeply resentful of anyone who threatened to take the spotlight away from her. Right as the waiter cleared our appetizer plates, Bridget let out a loud, theatrical sigh. She reached into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Her face contorted into a mask of pure manufactured anguish. Tears immediately welled up in her eyes as she slammed the papers down onto the center of the table. "I cannot hide this anymore," Bridget cried, her voice trembling loudly enough to draw the attention of the tables nearby. "I'm so sorry, Mom and Dad, but Penelope has been lying to all of us. She did not match into any residency program because she was expelled from medical school." I froze. My brain simply stopped processing information. I stared at the papers on the table. The top sheet had a poorly printed version of my university logo. Mom and Dad leaned forward, their faces draining of color, as Bridget pushed the papers toward them. "She was caught cheating on her final board exams," Bridget continued, letting a tear roll perfectly down her cheek. "And it gets worse. The school found out she has been using heavy narcotics. That is why she is always looking so tired and completely broke. She is an addict, Dad. She is a fraud." "What is this nonsense?" I finally managed to say, my voice cracking. I reached for the papers. They were crude forgeries, typed-up documents filled with dramatic legal jargon that no real academic institution would ever use. I looked at my father. "Dad, this is a complete fabrication. I have a perfect grade point average. I matched into my top choice hospital just last week. You saw the official email. I worked 80 hours a week to get here. I have never touched a drug in my entire life." But my father did not look at me. He was staring at the forged papers, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple. Frank and Diane cared about one thing above all else: their reputation. They were obsessed with status country club gossip and presenting a flawless image to their wealthy friends. The mere suggestion of a scandal, even an unverified one, was enough to ignite his fury. "Do not lie to me," my father growled, his voice vibrating with rage. "Your sister has the proof right here in writing. I always knew you were hiding something. Nobody works as many hours as you claim to work without chemical help. You have embarrassed this family for the last time." I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "Let me pull up my secure student portal right now. I will show you my transcripts. I will log into the National Matching Program website. Please just look at my phone." I shoved the screen toward him, but Frank slapped my hand away so hard my phone clattered onto the hardwood floor of the restaurant. He stood up, towering over the table. The surrounding patrons had completely stopped talking. The entire dining room was watching us. In a blind rage, my father grabbed his heavy crystal wine glass and hurled it at the floor. It shattered into 100 pieces, sending dark red wine splashing across the pristine white tablecloth and onto my shoes. "You are a disgrace to this family," he shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I will not have my name dragged through the mud by a cheating junkie. Get up, we are leaving." The car ride back to our sprawling suburban estate in Connecticut was a nightmare of suffocating silence. I sat in the back seat staring out the window into the dark night, my mind racing. I tried to speak twice, but Diane snapped at me to shut my mouth. Bridget sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally sniffing and wiping away fake tears, playing the role of the heartbroken sister perfectly. The moment we stepped through the heavy double doors of our home, the nightmare escalated. Diane marched straight into Frank's home office. She had always been paranoid about finances, and Bridget's wild accusations about drug debts had triggered her worst fears. She grabbed her tablet and quickly logged into the family's joint savings account, an account my parents used to fund Bridget's lifestyle, but which technically had my name on it as well for emergency household expenses. A piercing scream echoed from the office. Diane ran back into the grand foyer, her face pale and her eyes wide with panic. $50,000, she shrieked, holding the tablet out to my father. $50,000 has been wired out of our savings account yesterday. Bridget gasped loudly, covering her mouth with both hands. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger right at my chest. "The drugs," Bridget cried out, her voice echoing in the large hallway. "I told you. I saw messages on her laptop. She owed massive debts to her dealers. She stole your money to save her own skin." I stood there completely blindsided by the sheer audacity of her lies. I looked from the tablet to Bridget, and suddenly the pieces of the puzzle clicked together in my mind. Just last week, Bridget had returned from a lavish extended vacation in Las Vegas with her latest unemployed boyfriend. She had been posting photos online non-stop, showing off VIP bottle service at exclusive clubs, luxury casino suites, and designer shopping sprees. She did not have a job. My parents gave her an allowance, but it would never cover that level of extreme spending. "Are you insane?" I yelled, finally losing my composure. I stepped toward Bridget, but my father immediately blocked my path. "I did not take a single cent from that account. Bridget just spent 2 weeks living like a billionaire in Las Vegas. She stole that money to cover her luxury vacation, and now she is framing me to hide her own theft." Bridget burst into loud, hysterical sobs, collapsing onto the bottom step of the staircase. "How can you say that?" she wailed. "Mom. Dad, I would never steal from you. She is just trying to deflect because she got caught. She is a desperate addict." "Call the police right now," I demanded, looking directly into my father's eyes. "I have nothing to hide. Have the authorities trace that wire transfer. Have the bank pull the internet protocol address of the device that authorized the transaction. I guarantee you it will point straight to a hotel Wi-Fi network in Las Vegas. Call the police, Dad. Prove me wrong." For a fraction of a second, I saw doubt flicker in my father's eyes. Logic dictated that calling the bank and the police was the only rational step. But Frank was not a rational man when his social standing was on the line. The thought of police cruisers parked in his driveway, the thought of an official investigation, the terrifying possibility that his country club friends might find out his family was embroiled in a massive financial dispute over alleged drug debts, it was entirely unacceptable to him. Truth did not matter. Optics mattered. "There will be no police," Frank barked, his face twisting with disgust. "I am not having my reputation ruined and my business contacts gossiping about a police investigation in my own home. We will handle this internally." He had chosen the easiest path. He chose to sweep the missing $50,000 under the rug by blaming the daughter he had never truly valued, rather than exposing the crimes of his favorite child to the authorities. Diane marched right up to me. Her eyes were cold, completely void of any maternal affection. Without a word of warning, she raised her hand and slapped me hard across the cheek. The sharp sting radiated across my face, leaving a burning red mark. "Give me the keys to the Honda," Diane demanded, holding out her open palm. "You do not get to drive a car paid for by this family. You do not get to sleep under this roof. You have 10 minutes to pack your things and get out." But I paid for the gas. I paid for the maintenance. I pleaded, holding my burning cheek. I need that car to get to my hospital rotations. Please, you are making a massive mistake. 10 minutes, my father roared, pointing toward the stairs, or I will throw you out in the clothes on your back. And do not bother trying to access your checking account. I am calling the bank director right now to freeze every card connected to this household. I ran up the stairs, my vision blurred with tears of betrayal and rage. I burst into my bedroom and grabbed a faded canvas duffel bag from the closet. I did not bother packing dresses or makeup or shoes. I grabbed the only things that truly mattered for my survival. I packed my heavy medical textbooks, my diagnostic tools, my scrubs, my favorite stethoscope, and a few basic items of clothing. That was my entire life zipped up in one single bag. When I walked back down the grand staircase, the house was completely silent. Frank and Diane had retreated into the living room, turning their backs to the hallway, refusing to even look at me as I passed. I walked out the front door and stepped into the freezing, driving rain of the Connecticut night. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the dark. I pulled my thin jacket tight around my shoulders, the rain instantly soaking through the fabric. I stood in the driveway looking back at the massive house that I could no longer call home. Through the large bay window of the warmly lit living room, I saw Bridget. She was standing by the fireplace holding a glass of wine. The fake tears were completely gone. She looked right through the glass, met my eyes in the darkness, and gave me a slow, triumphant smirk. She raised her wine glass slightly in a mock toast, celebrating her absolute victory. She had stolen $50,000, destroyed my relationship with my parents, and secured her place as the sole heir to their wealth. I turned my back on the house and began to walk down the long, dark road. The rain beat down on my face, mixing with my tears, but my mind was suddenly incredibly clear. I gripped the strap of my canvas duffel bag, feeling the weight of my medical books pressing against my side. They had taken my car, my money, and my family, but they could not take my brain. They could not take my work ethic. I looked up at the stormy sky and made a silent vow. I will survive this. I will finish my residency. I will become the best surgeon in this state. And one day when sickness or tragedy strikes their perfect superficial lives, they will have to drop to their knees and beg the very doctor they just threw out into the rain. The first few months after being thrown out were a masterclass in brutal, unforgiving survival. I lived entirely out of the cramped, windowless residence on call rooms at the hospital, hiding my canvas duffel bag behind stacks of scratchy hospital linens, so the administration would not realize I was practically homeless. My parents had made good on their threat with terrifying speed. They completely froze my bank accounts and refused to provide any tax documentation, effectively locking me out of standard federal financial aid. To pay for my living expenses and the exorbitant costs of medical licensing exams, I was forced to take out predatory private student loans. The interest rates were astronomical, a financial death sentence for most ordinary people. But I signed the digital paperwork without a single moment of hesitation. I viewed that crippling debt not as a burden, but as the absolute price of my freedom. I was a first-year surgical resident, which meant I was already expected to work 80 hours a week for a salary that barely covered minimum wage when broken down by the hour. To survive, I had to take on extra moonlighting shifts as a triage physician in one of the most dangerous underfunded downtown emergency rooms in the city. My life became an endless, exhausting blur of blood trauma and harsh fluorescent lights. While my sister Bridget was undoubtedly spending my stolen savings on designer clothes and bottomless weekend brunches, I was up to my elbows in gunshot wounds, shattered bones, and failing hearts at 3 a.m. I lived on stale graham crackers from the hospital vending machines and bitter lukewarm coffee left over in the nurse's break room. I lost 15 pounds in the first 2 months alone. My surgical scrubs hung loosely on my shrinking frame, and the dark circles under my eyes looked like permanent bruises. There were nights when the physical exhaustion was so severe that my bones physically ached with every step I took. I would lock myself in a bathroom stall, slide down the cold tiled wall, and fight the overwhelming urge to just close my eyes and give up. In those dark, solitary moments, the voices of my parents would echo relentlessly in my mind. I could hear my mother calling me a worthless disappointment. I could hear my father telling me I was a disgrace who would never amount to anything. But instead of breaking me, those toxic memories became high-octane fuel. I channeled every single ounce of rage, rejection, and humiliation into my clinical work. I read advanced surgical journals while walking down the busy hallways. I practiced complex suturing techniques on orange peels in the cafeteria while other residents slept. When the annual American Board of Surgery and Training examination rolled around, I did not just pass. I scored in the top 1% of all surgical residents nationwide. I was rapidly becoming untouchable in the operating room, known among the senior staff for my razor-sharp precision and absolute chilling calm under extreme pressure. But no human body can sustain that level of punishment indefinitely, without cracking. My breaking point almost happened during a grueling 14-hour liver transplant. I had been awake for 36 hours straight, covering a brutal shift for another resident just to afford my upcoming rent payment for a tiny, unheated studio apartment I had finally managed to secure on the edge of town. As I stood over the operating table holding a heavy metal retractor, my vision suddenly blurred. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and my hands, usually steady as stone, began to tremble violently from severe hypoglycemia. The attending surgeon, a notorious tyrant who loved to break young doctors, opened his mouth to scream at me. But before he could utter a single word of reprimand, a calm, authoritative voice cut through the thick tension of the operating room. "Dr. Reed is stepping back from the table right now," the voice said. I looked up through my hazy vision and saw Caleb. He was a senior anesthesiology resident I had worked with a few times before, standing behind the surgical drape monitoring the patient's vitals with an intense protective focus. He looked directly at the furious attending surgeon and did not back down an inch. "Her blood sugar is crashing," Caleb stated firmly, stepping smoothly into the line of fire to shield me. "She has been on her feet for 36 hours, saving 3 massive trauma patients before this case even started. She is taking a mandated 15-minute break to consume glucose, or I am logging a severe safety violation with the chief of surgery this exact second." The attending glared, his eyes narrowing, but he snapped his mouth shut. Caleb nodded toward the door, silently commanding me to leave. When I stumbled into the scrub room, my legs finally gave out. Caleb walked in seconds later, handing me a carton of orange juice and a protein bar he had literally sprinted to the cafeteria to get. He did not ask intrusive questions. He did not offer unwanted pity or treat me like I was fragile. He simply sat on the bench next to me, radiating a quiet strength, making sure I drank every drop of the juice until the color finally returned to my pale face. That was the beginning of Caleb. He quickly became my anchor in the chaotic, relentless storm of my residency. He was brilliant, incredibly grounded, and fiercely protective of me. Unlike the men in my past who were intimidated by my raw ambition, Caleb celebrated it. He started bringing me home cooked meals packed in plastic containers, quietly leaving them at the nurse's station with my name on them so I would not skip lunch. When my grueling night shifts ended at dawn, I would often find him waiting by my rusted second-hand car in the parking garage just to make sure I got behind the wheel safely and did not fall asleep driving home. It took months for me to finally lower my walls and tell him the ugly truth about my family. I told him about the stolen $50,000, the forged university documents Bridget had created, and the night I was violently thrown out into the freezing rain. I expected him to doubt me, to ask if there was another side to the story, because that is what society usually does when a child is estranged from their wealthy, respectable parents. Instead, Caleb looked at me with a quiet, burning anger directed entirely at the people who had hurt me. Because he was pursuing a fellowship in medical law alongside his clinical work, he understood exactly how maliciously they had maneuvered to protect their fake social image over their own daughter. "You do not owe them a single ounce of your guilt," Caleb told me one night as we sat on the bare floor of my apartment eating cheap takeout. "You are building an absolute empire out of the rubble they left behind. Let them have their fake country club lives and their miserable lies. You are going to save lives, and I'm going to stand right beside you while you do it. With Caleb by my side, the crushing weight of my reality became manageable. I was no longer fighting alone in the dark. We became an unstoppable team in the hospital, coordinating complex trauma surgeries with a seamless, unspoken understanding. My debt was still massive, my apartment was still freezing, and my hours were still brutal, but my spirit was completely unbroken. I was rising from the mud they had kicked me into, sharpening my medical skills into a deadly weapon, silently preparing for the day the universe would inevitably force our paths to cross again. The years of relentless grinding finally culminated in the two biggest milestones of my life. I was officially graduating from my grueling surgical residency, stepping into the role of an attending trauma surgeon. At the exact same time, Caleb and I were planning our wedding. He had proposed on a quiet Tuesday evening in the hospital cafeteria, sliding a simple, elegant diamond ring across the laminate table between two emergency surgeries. It was not a grand cinematic gesture with hidden photographers and expensive champagne. It was raw, real, and absolutely perfect. We decided to combine the celebrations, hosting a beautiful, intimate wedding ceremony the weekend right after my graduation. When it came time to send out the invitations, I found myself staring at a blank cream-colored envelope for over an hour. My pen hovered above the thick paper. Frank and Diane Reed, my parents. It had been years since that night they threw me into the freezing rain. In all that time, they had not made a single attempt to contact me. They had not checked to see if I was alive, if I had a roof over my head, or if I had eaten. I had built an entire existence completely devoid of their presence. Yet a tiny, foolish fraction of my heart still harbored a sliver of hope. I thought that maybe, just maybe, seeing the official university seal on my graduation announcement and the elegant calligraphy of my wedding invitation might snap them out of their delusion. I thought seeing undeniable physical proof of my success as a doctor might make them realize the massive mistake they had made. I sealed the envelopes, paid for the premium postage, and dropped them into the mailbox, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and liberation. I did not expect a warm, tearful phone call. I did not expect them to suddenly show up on my doorstep begging for forgiveness. But I also did not expect the sheer, unadulterated malice of their actual response. Exactly 1 week later, I returned to the apartment Caleb and I shared after a brutal 14-hour trauma shift. There was a rigid, heavy parcel resting on the kitchen island. The return address was handwritten in the unmistakable sharp cursive of my mother, Diane. My heart gave a sudden, painful jolt against my ribs. Caleb walked into the kitchen, his medical badge still clipped to his scrubs, and watched as I reached for the package. He did not say a word, simply standing close enough to catch me if the emotional impact knocked me off my feet. I grabbed a pair of scissors and sliced through the thick packing tape. I opened the cardboard flaps, expecting to find the invitations returned with a simple cold return to sender stamp. What I found inside was so vicious it took my breath away. My beautiful, expensive, custom-printed invitations had not just been returned. They had been aggressively and meticulously destroyed. The heavy cardstock was shredded into dozens of tiny, jagged pieces. Someone had taken a pair of heavy scissors and cut right through my name, right through the university crest, right through the date of my wedding. Mixed in with the shredded paper was a single crisp white note card. I reached into the box with trembling fingers and pulled the note card out. My mother had written a message in bold black ink, pressing down so hard that the pen had nearly torn through the paper. Do not send your trash to my house. You are a psychotic dropout and a pathological liar. Bridget is marrying into a respectable family next month, and we will not have a desperate drug addict embarrassing us or trying to beg for money. Lose this address permanently. I stood in the center of my kitchen staring at those cruel, venomous words. I read the note a second time, then a third. I waited for the familiar sting of rejection. I waited for the hot tears of a discarded daughter to blur my vision. I waited for the urge to scream, to call them, to defend myself against the outrageous lie that I was an addict begging for cash. But the tears never came. The anger did not surface. Instead, a profound, absolute silence washed over my entire being. The last lingering thread of attachment I had to the people who shared my DNA instantly dissolved into nothing. They were not my parents. They were just two deeply toxic strangers who were completely blinded by their own arrogant delusions. They had chosen to believe the lies of a manipulative thief over the hard-earned reality of a dedicated surgeon. Caleb stepped forward, looking down into the box of shredded paper. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle ticking in his cheek. He looked at me, his eyes blazing with a fierce protective fury, waiting for me to break down. I calmly folded my mother's note in half. I picked up the entire cardboard box, walked over to the kitchen trash can, and dropped it all inside. The shredded paper, the vicious words, the remnants of my biological family, all of it went straight into the garbage where it belonged. They are dead to me, I said, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. Let them have their delusions. I have surgeries to perform and a wedding to attend. Caleb exhaled a long, heavy breath, his tense posture relaxing. He pulled me into a tight, grounding embrace, burying his face in my hair. You are the strongest person I have ever known, he whispered. When my wedding day arrived, the weather was absolutely spectacular. The sun was shining brilliantly across the manicured lawns of the historic estate we had rented for the occasion. I wore a stunning, fitted white gown that I had paid for in cash using money I had earned with my own two hands. As the classical music began to play, I did not have a father to walk me down the aisle. I did not have a mother sitting in the front row dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I did not have a sister standing beside me as a bridesmaid. And I did not care. I walked down that aisle entirely on my own, my head held high, my steps measured and confident. When I looked out at the audience, I did not see empty seats or missing relatives. I saw my chosen family. The front rows were packed with the brilliant, exhausted, fiercely loyal trauma nurses who had kept me sane during the darkest nights of my residency. I saw the stern attending surgeons who had pushed me to greatness now smiling with genuine pride. I saw the friends who had fed me, encouraged me, and stood by me when I had absolutely nothing. At the end of the aisle stood Caleb, looking incredibly handsome in his tailored suit. His eyes locked onto mine with a love so deep and unwavering it took my breath away. When I took his hand, the last ghost of my past vanished. I was no longer the frightened girl standing in the freezing rain. I was Dr. Penelope Reed, a top-tier trauma surgeon, a beloved partner, and a woman who had forged an empire out of pure willpower. As we exchanged our vows and the crowd erupted into cheers, I knew with absolute certainty that I had already won. The universe had a way of balancing the scales, and I was more than ready to face whatever came next. 3 years flew by with the relentless adrenaline-fueled rhythm of a Level 1 trauma center. I was 34 now and officially the youngest attending trauma surgeon in the hospital's history. My bank accounts were no longer frozen. They were thriving. Caleb and I had built a beautiful, peaceful life in a sleek downtown penthouse entirely funded by our own grueling medical careers. I rarely thought about the people who shared my DNA. They were ghosts from a past life, but ghosts have a funny way of appearing when you least expect them. It happened on a crisp Saturday afternoon at the most exclusive luxury shopping gallery in the city. I had just finished a brutal 48-hour on-call shift and decided to treat myself to a custom-tailored suit for an upcoming medical conference. I was wearing simple, comfortable clothes, dark designer jeans, a cashmere sweater, and flat shoes that saved my feet in the operating room. I was browsing through a rack of imported silk blouses when a sharp, unmistakable grating laugh pierced the quiet elegance of the boutique. I froze my hand, hovering over a midnight blue blouse. I turned my head slightly. Walking through the glass double doors was my mother Diane and my sister Bridget. They were flanked by 3 women I vaguely recognized as daughters of my father's wealthy country club associates. Bridget was an absolute walking billboard for financial excess. She wore a tweed Chanel jacket that cost more than a reliable used car oversized designer sunglasses resting on her perfectly blown-out hair, and a handbag that screamed newly acquired wealth. Diane walked beside her, with her nose practically pointing at the ceiling, looking at the retail workers like they were common peasants. Bridget spotted me almost immediately. Her eyes widened behind her designer frames, and that familiar malicious smirk crawled across her face. Instead of pretending not to know me or quietly turning away, she seized the opportunity for an audience. She marched right up to the rack where I was standing, her high heels clicking loudly against the polished marble floor. Her three wealthy friends followed close behind, whispering to each other with eager, hungry anticipation. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Bridget announced, projecting her voice so the entire high-end boutique could hear. "I did not think they let homeless dropouts past the security guards. Shopping for the clearance rack, Penelope. You know they do not take food stamps here, right?" I turned to face her fully. My posture was perfectly straight, honed by thousands of hours standing over operating tables and commanding trauma rooms. I looked at Bridget, then at my mother, who simply crossed her arms and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "I thought I told you to lose our address," Diane scoffed, looking me up and down, clearly unimpressed by my lack of visible, flashy logos. "I suppose your little drug habits finally caught up to you. Are you going to beg my daughter for cash? After all, she is marrying into real money next month. You must be desperate." Bridget let out a shrill, theatrical laugh, turning to her friends. "This is the psychotic sister I told you about, the one who got kicked out of medical school for stealing from our parents to buy pills. She is completely unstable. I am honestly surprised she is not living in a cardboard box by now." I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my medical degree, my spotless reputation, or the fact that I was currently making a high six-figure salary. I did not need to scream because I was holding a nuclear bomb of information in my back pocket. Just 2 days prior, Caleb had been tapping into his vast legal network to run a standard background check for a medical liability case. During his search, his system had flagged a highly suspicious public financial filing linked to my father's home address. Being the thorough, protective husband he is, Caleb dug a little deeper. What he found was nothing short of spectacular. Bridget was not independently wealthy. She was not a successful investor. She was a catastrophic, desperate gambler. She had secretly leveraged my parents' sprawling Connecticut estate, forging Frank's signature, to take out a massive high-interest second mortgage. Why? Because she had absolutely tanked $2 million into a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme. She was currently drowning in so much toxic high-yield debt that her creditors were weeks away from initiating a brutal, unyielding foreclosure on the very house I was thrown out of. Her upcoming high society wedding was not a celebration of love. It was a desperate, panicked transaction to secure a wealthy husband before the bank seized her parents' assets and exposed her as a monumental fraud. I looked at the Chanel jacket she was wearing. I looked at the heavy diamond ring on her finger, bought with stolen equity and desperate lies. A slow, genuinely amused smile spread across my face. It was the calm, terrifying smile of a surgeon who knows exactly where the vital artery is and precisely how to cut it. "You look incredibly expensive today, Bridget," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. "That jacket must have cost a fortune. I hope you kept the receipt." Bridget narrowed her eyes, her smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second. "What is that supposed to mean, you jealous freak?" "It means," I replied, stepping just an inch closer so only she and Diane could hear the absolute ice in my tone, "that winter is coming very soon for you. You might want to hold on to your cash instead of playing dress up for your friends. Crypto markets are incredibly volatile this time of year, are they not?" The effect was instantaneous and utterly glorious. All the blood completely drained from Bridget's face. The arrogant, mocking light in her eyes extinguished, replaced by a sudden, stark, visceral panic. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She took a tiny, involuntary step backward, her hand flying to her chest, as if she had just been physically struck. Diane frowned, clearly missing the context of my threat. "Stop talking your psychiatric nonsense to my daughter," Diane snapped, grabbing Bridget's arm. "Let us go, Bridget. I cannot stand the stench of failure." I did not stop them. I simply watched as Bridget stumbled slightly in her expensive heels, allowing her mother to pull her out of the boutique. She looked back at me over her shoulder, her eyes wide with absolute terror, wondering how the sister she had thrown into the gutter could possibly know the darkest, most destructive secret of her entire life. I turned back to the rack of silk blouses, feeling a profound, untouchable peace. I did not need to destroy them today. They had already built the trap, loaded the gun, and handed me the trigger. All I had to do was wait for the inevitable, spectacular explosion. 2 weeks after the incident at the luxury boutique, an email landed in my professional inbox. It bypassed my personal address, completely sent directly through the hospital's surgical department directory. Bridget had tracked down my public contact information. The subject line read, "Family Obligation." The message was dripping with passive-aggressive venom. It was a formal summons to her pre-wedding VIP engagement party at the prestigious Harbor Point Yacht Club. She wrote that her future in-laws, the Sinclair family, insisted on meeting her estranged sister. She explicitly stated that I was required to attend to prove I was not entirely unstable and to show respect for the people saving our family legacy. She even added a postscript suggesting I rent a decent dress so I would not embarrass them in front of real wealth. I showed the email to Caleb across our kitchen island. He read it, his eyes scanning the incredibly arrogant words, and let out a low, dry laugh. "She is walking right into a minefield," he said, tossing his phone down onto the marble counter. "She actually thinks she holds the cards. Are you going to go?" I looked at the digital calendar on my phone. My schedule was clear that Saturday evening. "I am going," I replied smoothly. "I want a front row seat when her entire fake empire crumbles into the ocean." The Harbor Point Yacht Club was a monument to generational wealth, all white pillars, manicured lawns, and docks lined with multi-million-dollar vessels. I arrived precisely on time. I did not rent a dress as my sister had so graciously suggested. Instead, I wore a tailored midnight blue silk sheath dress that I had purchased in Milan during a medical conference last year. It had no flashy logos, no ostentatious sequins, just the flawless, quiet elegance of true craftsmanship. I paired it with simple pearl earrings and my favorite pair of comfortable, understated heels. I looked exactly like what I was, a highly successful, self-made professional who had absolutely nothing to prove. When I stepped onto the expansive wooden deck overlooking the water, the party was already in full swing. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with silver trays of champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. A jazz quartet played softly in the background. I scanned the crowd and immediately spotted my family holding court near the edge of the deck. Frank and Diane were dressed to the nines, laughing too loudly and desperately clinging to the attention of an older, distinguished-looking couple, clearly the Sinclair parents. Bridget stood between them, clinging to the arm of a tall, remarkably bland-looking man who had to be Preston Sinclair. She wore a sparkling, heavily beaded gown that looked more appropriate for a red carpet event than a breezy yacht club evening. She was projecting pure manufactured perfection. I took a steadying breath and walked directly toward them. My posture was straight, my expression completely neutral. Diane saw me first. Her fake bright smile instantly dropped, replaced by a flash of genuine panic before she forced it back onto her face. She leaned in and whispered furiously to Frank. Bridget turned her head, her eyes locking onto mine. For a split second, the terror I had seen in the boutique flashed across her face, the terrifying realization that I held the keys to her financial destruction. But her pathological need to dominate and perform quickly overpowered her fear. She plastered on a wide artificial smile and waved me over. "Look, everyone," Bridget announced, her voice pitched unnaturally high to ensure maximum attention from the surrounding guests. "My sister actually made it. I am so glad you could take a night off from whatever little job you are doing these days to support me." As I stepped closer, Bridget suddenly stumbled forward in her high heels. She thrust her hand out intentionally, tipping her full glass of dark red wine directly toward my silk dress. It was a calculated, vicious move designed to humiliate me and force me to leave. But my reflexes were trained in the chaos of the trauma bay. I stepped smoothly and swiftly to the side. The red wine missed my dress completely and splashed violently all over the crisp white trousers of Preston Sinclair, her wealthy fiancé. Preston gasped, jumping back as the dark red stain spread rapidly across his expensive pants. "Oh my God!" Bridget shrieked, her face flushing with genuine panic as she realized her calculated stunt had completely backfired. She immediately turned her glare on me, trying to salvage her power play and shift the blame. "Penelope, look what you made me do. Go grab some towels from the catering staff and clean this up right now. Be useful for once." She turned to Mrs. Sinclair, the intimidating matriarch of the family, who was staring at the spilled wine with clear disapproval. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Sinclair," Bridget stammered. "Penelope is incredibly clumsy. We try to include her, but she is essentially a charity case. I will have her clean this up immediately." The wealthy woman looked at me, assessing my calm demeanor and my flawless, unstained silk dress. I did not look like a charity case. I did not move a single muscle toward the catering staff. "I am not your maid, Bridget," I said, my voice steady and resonant enough for the entire circle to hear. "I am a guest. And you tripped over your own feet." Mrs. Sinclair tilted her head, her sharp eyes studying me with renewed interest. "Bridget mentioned you have had some struggles finding a career path, Penelope. What exactly is it that you do?" I smiled politely, making direct, unwavering eye contact with the matriarch. "I am a physician," I replied. "Specifically, I am the chief of trauma surgery at Beacon Hill University Hospital. I oversee the emergency surgical department and direct the resident training program." Total absolute silence fell over our immediate circle. Mrs. Sinclair's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise and immediate respect. "A trauma surgeon," she repeated, the tone of her voice shifting entirely from polite dismissal to serious engagement. "That is an incredibly demanding and prestigious position. Bridget, you never mentioned your sister was a chief surgeon. You simply said she was a troubled dropout." Bridget's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson. She stammered, her eyes darting frantically toward Diane for help. "Well, I mean, she did leave her original program. We just lost touch. I did not know she went back to finish." "I did not leave my program," I corrected her, keeping my tone light, but absolutely lethal. "I graduated at the top of my class. I just chose to build my career independently. It requires intense focus, which means I do not have much time for socializing or attending lavish parties. But I could not miss seeing Bridget tonight. After all, she has so much invested in this wedding." I let the word invested hang heavily in the warm evening air. Bridget swallowed hard. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid. She knew exactly what I was referencing. The $2 million crypto debt, the forged second mortgage, the impending foreclosure of the estate our parents were currently bragging about. She was standing on a fragile trap door, and she knew my hand was resting firmly on the lever. I maintained my polite smile, watching the sheer terror consume her from the inside out. Bridget's terror rapidly mutated into blinding, irrational rage. She could not accept the reality that I, the sister she had spent her entire life trying to destroy, was now commanding the respect of the very woman she desperately needed to impress. Mrs. Sinclair was still looking at me with genuine intrigue, opening her mouth to ask me which hospital I was affiliated with. I prepared to answer, but Bridget completely snapped. Her pathological need to dominate obliterated whatever fragile self-control she had left. She spun around and snatched a fresh, brimming glass of dark vintage Merlot from a passing caterer's silver tray. She did not even bother to make it look like an accident this time. With a vicious, deliberate lunge, she drove her shoulder forward and slammed the heavy crystal glass directly into my chest. The glass did not shatter, but the contents emptied completely over me. The dark, sticky wine cascaded down the front of my tailored midnight blue silk dress, pooling at my waist and splashing heavily onto my leather shoes. The jazz quartet abruptly stopped playing. The entire outdoor deck of the Harbor Point Yacht Club fell into a dead, horrifying silence. Guests turned their heads, their eyes wide with shock. Waiters froze in their tracks. Bridget did not apologize. She did not pretend to be clumsy. The mask of the sweet, perfect bride was completely gone, replaced by the ugly, sneering face of a cornered bully. She pointed her finger right at my face, her voice echoing sharply across the wooden deck for every single wealthy guest to hear. "Oh, look at you, Bridget!" yelled her tone dripping with venom and supreme arrogance. "You are used to being a waitress, aren't you? Go get a rag and clean it up yourself. Maybe the club manager will let you bus tables tonight to pay for your cab ride back to whatever miserable hole you crawled out of." I stood perfectly still, the cold wine soaked through the thin silk clinging uncomfortably to my skin. I did not gasp. I did not cry out. I did not raise my hand to strike her. I simply looked down at my ruined dress, then slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. The sheer lack of reaction from me seemed to unnerve her even more than if I had screamed. But the damage to the social atmosphere was already done. The Sinclair family, who had been momentarily fascinated by my medical career, instantly recoiled. In their world of extreme wealth and generational privilege, public outbursts and messy family drama were the ultimate unforgivable sins. Mrs. Sinclair took a distinct step backward, pulling her expensive shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her expression of respect morphed instantly into one of profound disdain. Preston Sinclair grabbed Bridget's arm, pulling her slightly behind him, looking at me as if I were a dangerous animal that had broken into their pristine enclosure. They did not see a brilliant trauma surgeon anymore. They only saw the chaotic, unstable sister that Bridget and my parents had warned them about. Sensing the immediate shift in the Sinclair's demeanor, my father realized he was losing his grip on the wealthy in-laws. Frank stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and extreme embarrassment. He positioned himself directly between me and the Sinclair family, physically blocking me from their view, as if shielding them from a highly contagious disease. "Do not listen to a single word this woman says," Frank announced, his voice booming loud enough for the surrounding crowd of elite guests to hear. He pointed an accusatory finger at my wine-soaked dress. "She is a pathological liar and a master manipulator. She is not a chief surgeon. She is nothing but a delusional fraud who bought a fake medical badge online to infiltrate this party. She is the absolute stain of our family line, a disgraced addict who crashed this beautiful evening just to extort us." Diane immediately rushed to his side, clutching her chest and forcing dramatic tears into her eyes. "We tried everything to help her," Diane cried out to Mrs. Sinclair, playing the role of the tragic, long-suffering mother to absolute perfection. "We sent her to the best rehabilitation centers, but the drugs completely destroyed her mind. We had to cut ties to protect Bridget. And now she shows up here completely unhinged, just to ruin the happiest day of her sister's life. Please forgive us for this horrendous intrusion." The crowd began to murmur. Judgmental whispers floated through the warm evening breeze. Guests looked at me with a mixture of pity and revulsion. To them, the narrative was perfectly clear. I was the deranged, jealous outcast sibling throwing a desperate tantrum at a high society event, and Frank and Diane were the noble parents valiantly trying to protect their perfect daughter from my toxicity. Frank signaled to one of the yacht club security guards standing near the entrance. "Officer, please escort this woman off the premises immediately. She is trespassing and causing a severe disturbance." The security guard, a burly man in a dark suit, began walking purposefully toward me. Bridget stood behind our father, a triumphant, malicious grin plastered across her face. She thought she had won. She thought the public humiliation would break me, forcing me to run away in tears, retreating back into the shadows, just like I did 5 years ago, when they threw me out into the rain. She thought her lies had successfully insulated her fraudulent life. I did not move. I calmly reached into my clutch and pulled out a small, pristine white tissue. I methodically dabbed a stray drop of wine from my collarbone. My resting heart rate did not elevate a single beat. I looked at the security guard approaching me, and I held up one single finger, a silent, commanding gesture of absolute authority that I used every single day to stop frantic nurses in the middle of a chaotic trauma resuscitation. The guard actually froze in his tracks, instinctively halting under the sheer weight of my professional command. I turned my gaze back to Frank. A stain on the family line. I repeated, my voice incredibly soft, yet carrying an icy resonance that sliced right through the murmuring crowd. That is a truly fascinating choice of words, Frank, especially considering the massive unforgivable stains currently saturating your financial portfolios. Frank's jaw tightened. He glared at me, trying to maintain his aggressive posture, but a tiny flicker of unease crossed his eyes. "What are you rambling about, you lunatic?" he hissed. I ignored him and looked directly at Bridget. Her triumphant smile had vanished. The color was rapidly draining from her cheeks again as she realized I was not running away in shame. "You think ruining a piece of silk will save you, Bridget?" I asked calmly. "You think putting on a show for the Sinclairs will stop the inevitable? You can call me a waitress, a drug addict, and a stain all you want. But soon enough, your wealthy new friends are going to find out exactly who the real fraud in this family is." I dropped the wine-soaked tissue onto the wooden deck right at Bridget's feet. I did not need to scream to win this battle. I just needed to let the poison of their own actions finish the job. I gave the Sinclair family one final polite nod, then turned my back on the entire gathering. I walked away with my head held high, my ruined dress clinging to me like a badge of honor, knowing that the real carnage was only just beginning. The security guard hesitated, his eyes darting between my father's red face and my own calm, unwavering gaze. He could feel the shift in the air. The elite guests of the Harbor Point Yacht Club were now leaning in their hunger for scandal, outweighing their sense of decorum. Frank saw the hesitation and decided to escalate. He grabbed a silver spoon from a nearby dessert table and began tapping it against his crystal glass, the sharp, ringing sound cutting through the jazz quartet's fading melody. He wanted everyone to witness this. He wanted to make sure the Sinclair family knew that Penelope was no longer a reed. "Attention, please." Frank shouted, his voice echoing across the deck. "Since my eldest daughter has seen fit to crash this celebration with her delusions of success and chief surgeon titles, I want to clarify a few things for our honored guests and our new family, the Sinclairs." Diane stepped up beside him, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, looking every bit the victimized mother. She leaned into the microphone a guest speaker had left on a nearby podium. "We have spent years trying to lead Penelope toward a respectable life," Diane said, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "But she has chosen a path of deceit and dependency. To protect our family name and our assets from being drained by her addictions, Frank and I have made a final legal decision." Frank took the microphone, his chest puffed out like a peacock. "Today, in the presence of the Sinclair family, I am announcing an official amendment to our family estate. Bridget has always been our rock. She has remained loyal, focused, and represents the very best of our values. Therefore, we have finalized a new will. Bridget will be the sole heir to 100% of our family assets. This includes our Beacon Hill estate, the summer house in the Hamptons, and our entire diversified investment portfolio. As for Penelope, she is being removed from all trust funds and inheritance structures immediately. She will receive nothing, not a single cent. She is officially cut off, and from this moment forward, the Reed family name no longer carries any responsibility for her actions or her debts." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Some people looked at me with pity, but most looked with the cold, judgmental eyes of those who worshipped at the altar of net worth. Bridget stood there clutching Preston Sinclair's arm, her head tilted back in a pose of supreme victory. She looked like she had just been crowned queen of the world. She leaned over and whispered something into Preston's ear, making him chuckle. The Sinclair matriarch gave a short, approving nod, clearly satisfied that the problem daughter had been dealt with and the family fortune was secured in the hands of the more compliant sister. I did not break. I did not cry. I did not even look surprised. Instead, I waited for the silence to settle, for the last echo of my father's voice to die down over the water. I saw a waiter passing with a tray of vintage Krug champagne. I reached out and took a glass, my movements fluid and precise. I stepped forward into the center of the circle and raised the glass toward Bridget. My silk dress was still soaked with red wine, but I carried the ruin as if it were a royal robe. "Well, that was a truly moving performance, Frank," I said, my voice projecting with a clarity that silenced the remaining whispers. "I want to be the first to congratulate my sister. Truly, Bridget, you have earned this." Bridget sneered, her eyes glittering with malice. You can keep your fake congratulations, Penelope. Just get out before security has to drag you through the lobby. You heard, Dad? You have nothing now. I smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that made the blood drain from Bridget's face. Oh, I heard him, I replied. And I am actually relieved. You see, I was worried about the legal complications of being tied to this family's future, but now that I am officially removed, I can speak freely. I turned my attention to the Sinclair family, who were watching me with renewed suspicion. Mrs. Sinclair, I know how much you value financial transparency and the integrity of a family's portfolio. It is what your investment firm is built on, is it not? The older woman narrowed her eyes. What are you getting at, Penelope? I turned back to Bridget, who was now visibly trembling. I hope that 100% inheritance includes the $2 million black hole currently sitting in the Reed family accounts, I said conversationally. Because I have been reviewing some very interesting credit reports and mortgage filings recently. Bridget, did you tell Mom and Dad that the crypto scheme you invested in last year didn't just fail, but that it was a total wash? Or did you forget to mention that you forged Dad's signature on a high-interest second mortgage on the Beacon Hill house to cover your margin calls? The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Frank looked at me, then at Bridget, his expression shifting from rage to confusion. What is she talking about, Bridget? That house is clear. I paid it off 5 years ago. Bridget's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes were darting around the deck like a trapped animal. She tried to force a laugh, but it came out as a strangled, pathetic sound. She is lying, Dad. She is just trying to ruin my night because you cut her out. She is crazy, remember? Is she? I asked, pulling my phone from my clutch. Because the Public Records Office in Connecticut has a very interesting filing from 3 weeks ago. A mortgage deed for $1.5 million signed by a Frank Reed. Except the signature has a very peculiar flourish on the letter R that Frank hasn't used in 20 years. It looks exactly like the way Bridget used to sign our permission slips in high school. And Mrs. Sinclair, you might be interested to know that the Sinclair's wedding gift of $500,000 for the down payment on the new condo, Bridget didn't put it in escrow. She wired it to a private wallet for a digital currency called Luna just 48 hours after the engagement party. Preston Sinclair stepped away from Bridget as if she were on fire. Bridget, is this true? Where is that money? Bridget grabbed his hand, her voice becoming high and hysterical. Preston, she is making it up. She is jealous. She wants to destroy us because she is a failure. Mom, tell them. Diane looked at Bridget, then at Frank, the first seed of doubt finally sprouting through her blind favoritism. Bridget, why are you shaking? Frank, call the bank. Call them right now. I won't have to, I said, taking a final sip of my champagne. The bank will be calling you on Monday morning. In fact, based on the default notice that was generated yesterday, they are already initiating foreclosure on the Beacon Hill estate. It turns out that when you inherit 100% of the Reed assets, you also inherit 100% of Bridget's criminal fraud. I looked at the Sinclair matriarch, whose face was now a mask of pure, frigid fury. She didn't look at me. She looked at Bridget with an expression that made my father's previous rage look like a tantrum. The Sinclair family did not do business with frauds. They did not marry into scandals. I think I have had enough of this vintage, I said, setting my empty glass back on the waiter's tray. Bridget, I truly hope you enjoy your new home. Although from what I hear about the current real estate market for foreclosed properties, you might find the sleeping arrangements a bit tight. I turned and walked away, the sound of my father's roar of realization and my mother's first genuine scream of panic echoing behind me. I didn't need to stay for the rest. I knew the Sinclair family would be out of that yacht club and calling their lawyers within the hour. The trap had snapped shut, and I was the only one walking free. I was halfway to the exit of the yacht club, my back turned to the utter devastation I had just unleashed. The satisfying sound of my parents panicking and Preston Sinclair loudly demanding answers from my father was absolute music to my ears. Mrs. Sinclair was already summoning her private security detail to escort her family away from the humiliating spectacle. The trap had closed perfectly. I was ready to walk to my car, drive back to my peaceful penthouse, and leave them to drown in the financial ruin they had created for themselves. Then a sharp guttural gasp cut through the arguing. It was a horrible, unnatural sound that instantly silenced the remaining chatter on the deck. I stopped and turned around. Bridget was standing near the dessert table, but she was no longer looking at Preston or our parents. She was clutching the heavy, sparkling beads of her designer gown right over the center of her chest. Her eyes were blown wide open. Her pupils were dilated to the point where the bright blue irises were almost completely swallowed by pitch black. She was struggling to drag oxygen into her lungs, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She staggered backward, her expensive high heels twisting violently underneath her weight. Her arms shot out blindly, grasping for the edge of a cocktail table, but her fingers missed the linen cloth entirely. Bridget hit the polished wooden deck with a sickening, heavy thud. Her entire body went completely rigid for a split second, her spine arching upward in an unnatural, rigid bow. Then the violent convulsions took over. Her arms and legs began to thrash wildly against the expensive hardwood floor. It was a full, massive tonic-clonic seizure. Her head slammed repeatedly against the wooden planks. A thick white foam began to bubble rapidly at the corners of her mouth, spilling down her chin and ruining the flawless, expensive makeup Diane had paid a fortune for. The elite yacht club erupted into absolute, unadulterated pandemonium. The wealthy socialites who just moments ago had been looking down their noses at my wine-stained dress were now screaming in sheer terror. They scrambled backward, knocking over chairs and shattering crystal champagne flutes in their desperate rush to get away from the convulsing bride. Preston Sinclair jumped backward as if Bridget had suddenly caught fire. He did not drop to his knees to hold the woman he was supposed to marry. He did not offer comfort or try to protect her head from the hard deck. He backed directly into his mother, his face pale with revulsion and shock. The Sinclair family did not do medical emergencies. They certainly did not do public foaming at the mouth spectacles. Diane let out a blood-curdling shriek that tore through the warm night air. She threw herself onto the wooden deck beside Bridget, her designer gown soaking up the spilled wine and shattered glass. She reached out and tried to grab Bridget's flailing arms, trying to physically pin her thrashing daughter down to the floor, which is the absolute worst and most dangerous thing a person can do during an active seizure. "Help her!" Diane screamed, her voice cracking with pure, unhinged terror. "Somebody call an ambulance right now. She is dying. My baby is dying." Frank stood frozen a few feet away, completely paralyzed by the sudden catastrophic destruction of his perfect night. His mouth hung open, his hands trembling at his sides, entirely useless in the face of a genuine medical crisis. I did not run toward them. I did not scream for help. I did not fall to my knees and weep for the sister who had just tried to publicly destroy me. I simply took one calm, measured step back, crossed my arms tightly over my chest, and watched her. My brain instantly shifted from betrayed daughter to chief of trauma surgery. The transition was automatic, absolute, and completely devoid of any familial emotion. I was no longer looking at my sister. I was looking at a clinical presentation. I watched her body mechanics with the cold, assessing eyes of a medical professional. The violent, rhythmic muscle contractions. The severe diaphoresis causing sweat to pour down her face. The jaw clenching tightly enough to crack teeth. The foaming at the mouth and the extreme pupil dilation told a very specific, undeniable clinical story. This was not a stress-induced panic attack caused by my financial revelations. This was not a sudden onset neurological condition or an unpredictable seizure disorder. This was a massive, catastrophic physiological reaction to a severe chemical overload. She was overdosing right there on the yacht club deck. The heavy illicit narcotics she had accused me of using 5 years ago were currently frying her own central nervous system. Someone in the crowd finally had the sense to dial emergency services. Sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder as they tore through the quiet coastal neighborhood. Diane looked up from Bridget's convulsing body, her eyes wild with panic, and locked onto me. She saw me standing there perfectly still, analyzing the situation without a single shred of panic or urgency. "Do something!" Diane shrieked at me, her voice tearing at her vocal cords. "You are a doctor! Save her! Save your sister!" I did not move to touch Bridget. Without proper intravenous medications, airway management tools, or monitoring equipment, physically intervening during an active drug-induced grand mal seizure could cause more harm than good, especially with Diane actively making it worse. Roll her onto her side so she does not aspirate on her own fluids, I instructed calmly, my voice slicing effortlessly through the hysterical screaming of the crowd. And stop holding her arms down, Diane. You are going to dislocate her shoulders or snap her humerus. Let the seizure run its course. Diane stared at me like I was a monster, but she frantically pushed Bridget onto her side. The heavy wooden doors of the deck burst open. A team of paramedics sprinted onto the patio carrying heavy red trauma bags and a collapsible stretcher. They immediately took over barking medical codes at each other, securing Bridget's airway and preparing to load her thrashing body onto the gurney. I watched them work with professional detachment. Based on the designated trauma zoning protocols for this specific district, I knew exactly which hospital they were required to transport a critical patient to. They were heading straight to Beacon Hill University Hospital. My hospital. The exact place where I held absolute, unquestionable authority over life and death. I uncrossed my arms, smoothed down the ruined silk of my dress, and turned toward the exit. I did not offer to ride in the ambulance. I did not offer to hold my mother's hand. I simply walked to my car, pulled out my phone, and texted my chief surgical resident to prepare the red zone trauma bay for an incoming critical overdose. The real show was about to begin, and it was happening entirely on my territory. The wail of the ambulance sirens pierced the heavy night air, echoing violently off the concrete walls of the ambulance bay at Beacon Hill University Hospital. The paramedic rig slammed to a halt, and the heavy rear doors flew open. A team of emergency medical technicians rushed the stretcher through the automatic sliding glass doors and into the blinding fluorescent lights of the trauma center. Bridget was strapped down tightly, an oxygen mask covering her face, her body still twitching with violent, uncontrolled postictal tremors from the massive overdose. The paramedics shouted vital signs and medication dosages to the receiving nurses, rushing her straight past the crowded waiting room and directly into the highly secure red zone trauma bays. Frank and Diane arrived exactly 4 minutes later in the back of a rideshare vehicle, having abandoned their own car at the yacht club in their frantic, disorganized panic. They burst through the main emergency department entrance like a hurricane of ruined silk and aggressive entitlement. Diane wore a designer gown that was torn at the hem and severely stained with dried red wine. Frank was missing his expensive tuxedo jacket, and his silk tie hung loose and crooked around his neck. Despite looking like they had just survived a shipwreck, their profound, pathological arrogance remained completely intact. In their minds, a hospital was simply another service industry establishment, a place where money, status, and screaming could effortlessly bypass any established protocol or medical triage system. The emergency room waiting area was packed with suffering people. There were anxious mothers holding children with high fevers, men with broken limbs gripping ice packs, and elderly patients waiting quietly for their names to be called by a triage nurse. Frank completely ignored every single one of them. He did not take a number from the automated kiosk. He did not wait in the designated line behind the yellow privacy strip on the floor. He marched straight to the front of the bulletproof glass partition at the main intake desk and slammed his heavy fist against the counter, startling a young administrative clerk. "Where is my daughter?" Frank roared, his face turning a dangerous, volatile shade of crimson. "They just brought her in through the ambulance bay. Her name is Bridget Reed. We demand to be taken to her private room immediately." The intake nurse, a seasoned veteran named Martinez, who had dealt with every conceivable type of trauma and entitlement over her 20-year career, did not flinch. She kept her voice steady, clinical, and strictly professional. "Sir, I need you to step back from the glass and lower your voice. If your daughter was just brought in by ambulance as a critical code, she is currently being stabilized by our advanced trauma team. You cannot go back there right now. I need your identification and her insurance information to start the intake file." Diane pushed herself aggressively against the glass, her eyes manic and furious. She pointed a shaking, perfectly manicured finger directly at the nurse's face. "You clearly do not understand who you are dealing with. My daughter is marrying into the Sinclair family. The Sinclairs. They own half the investment firms in this state. She is going to be a billionaire's wife, and you are treating us like we are common street trash, waiting for a free clinic handout. Take us to her room right this second. Nurse Martinez typed something into her computer system, completely unbothered by the aggressive name-dropping. Ma'am, this is a level 1 trauma center. We do not care if your daughter is marrying royalty. We treat patients based on medical acuity and triage protocols, not bank account balances. The doctors are actively working to save her life. You need to sit down in the waiting area until a physician comes out to update you on her status. Frank let out a sound of pure, unadulterated outrage. He reached into his leather wallet, pulled out a heavy metal American Express Centurion card, and slammed it onto the stainless steel counter with a sharp, aggressive clack. Listen to me very carefully, you incompetent desk clerk. Frank sneered, leaning dangerously close to the speaker slot in the glass partition. I am not sitting in those cheap plastic chairs with these people. I am paying for premium exclusive care, and I am paying for it right now. Swipe the card for whatever exorbitant amount you want. $10,000, $50,000. I do not care. I demand a private VIP suite for Bridget, and I demand that you page the highest-ranking doctor in this miserable building immediately. Diane nodded frantically, slamming her own hands flat on the counter. We will not have some exhausted second-rate medical intern practicing on our precious daughter. She is suffering from extreme stress because of a horrific family dispute caused by a jealous relative. She needs top-tier care. Call the chief of surgery. Call them right now. You cannot afford to lose her life. If she gets a single scratch on her under your care, I will personally see to it that this hospital is sued into absolute bankruptcy, and every single one of you is fired by the board of directors. The sheer delusion of their demands was staggering. They were standing in one of the busiest, most high-stakes emergency departments on the East Coast, demanding the chief of surgery treat a severe illicit drug overdose, like it was a boutique spa appointment. They were desperately clinging to the crumbling illusion of their high society status, completely ignoring the terrifying fact that they were currently facing total financial ruin and a massive bank foreclosure. In their distorted minds, screaming loud enough and throwing around an elite credit card could magically erase the catastrophic reality of the evening. Nurse Martinez looked down at the black credit card resting on the counter. She did not reach for it. Instead, she looked Frank dead in the eye, her patients officially exhausted by the violent disruption they were causing in her emergency room. Sir, put your credit card away, Nurse Martinez instructed coldly. You cannot buy a doctor here. And for your information, if your daughter was brought in as a critical code, the chief of trauma surgery is already standing over her in the resuscitation bay. That is standard protocol for high-level life-threatening emergencies. Frank puffed out his chest, mistakenly believing his aggressive intimidation tactics had actually worked. Good, he snapped, snatching the credit card back and shoving it aggressively into his wallet. Then you go back there and you tell the chief of surgery that the Reed family expects a full immediate briefing. Tell them we expect absolute discretion and world-class treatment. Go tell them right now. The charge nurse, who had been listening to the entire hostile exchange from the adjoining desk, stepped forward. She looked at Frank and Diane with a mixture of profound annoyance and strict clinical detachment. She reached for the heavy black receiver of the emergency paging system, her finger hovering over the bright red button that broadcasted directly into the sterile hallways of the surgical department. You want the chief of trauma surgery? The charge nurse asked, her voice echoing slightly through the glass partition. Yes! Diane shrieked, her voice cracking with hysterical, unearned authority. Page them immediately. Tell them the parents of Bridget Reed demand their presence. We are not waiting another minute. The charge nurse pressed the button. The overhead speakers in the crowded emergency waiting room crackled to life. Chief of Trauma Surgery to the main family intake desk, the automated voice announced loudly. Chief of Trauma Surgery family briefing required at main intake. Frank adjusted his collar, trying to restore some semblance of his commanding, wealthy persona. He stood taller, preparing to unleash another wave of arrogant demands and legal threats onto whoever the hospital had placed in charge. Diane wiped her ruined makeup, lifting her chin ready to play the wealthy, demanding mother to absolute perfection. They had absolutely no idea that the very doctor they were so aggressively demanding to see the person holding the absolute power of life and death over their precious golden child was the exact same daughter they had thrown into the freezing rain 5 years ago. The overhead paging system echoed through the sterile corridors of the emergency department. The automated voice cut through the ambient noise of crying children and beeping monitors. It summoned the chief of trauma surgery to the main family intake desk. Frank stood taller. He adjusted his ruined, wine-stained tuxedo collar. He squared his shoulders and puffed out his chest, desperately trying to project an aura of immense wealth and unyielding authority. Diane mirrored his actions. She smoothed the front of her torn designer gown and gripped her oversized Hermes handbag like a royal scepter. They were preparing to speak to someone they considered an equal. They fully expected an older, distinguished man in a pristine white coat to walk through those doors. They expected someone they could bully, bribe, or intimidate with threats of lawsuits and board member connections. The heavy frosted glass double doors separating the public waiting area from the restricted red zone trauma bays hummed mechanically. The red warning light above the frame began to flash rapidly. The doors slid violently open, hitting their tracks with a loud, definitive thud. I stepped through the threshold, leaving the chaotic, blood-soaked symphony of ventilators and cardiac monitors behind me. I did not wear a crisp white coat. I wore dark, surgical blue scrubs. The fabric clung to my frame, slightly damp with sweat from the intense, grueling resuscitation effort I had just orchestrated. My surgical mask was pulled down, resting loosely around my neck. A heavy cardiology stethoscope was draped across my shoulders. My sensible, fluid-resistant surgical clogs squeaked slightly against the polished linoleum floor. But the most important detail was pinned securely to my chest. Catching the harsh fluorescent light shining like a beacon of absolute undeniable truth was my official hospital identification badge. The bold black lettering was impossible to miss. Dr. Penelope Reed, Chief of Trauma Surgery. I walked methodically toward the intake desk, my gaze locked directly onto my parents. I did not blink. I did not waver. The transformation in their faces was an absolute masterpiece of human psychology breaking down in real time. Diane saw me first. The practiced, arrogant sneer melted right off her face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. Her jaw went completely slack. Her fingers gripping the handle of her expensive bag lost all their strength. The oversized Hermes handbag slipped from her grasp. It hit the hard hospital floor with a heavy, unceremonious thud. The clasp popped open, spilling gold credit cards, a country club membership ID, and an expensive tube of lipstick across the scuffed tiles. She did not even look down. She lunged sideways, her hands shooting out to grab Frank's forearm. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug into his flesh with such frantic, terrified force that I could practically see the dark purple bruises forming under his wrinkled shirt sleeve. Frank turned his head, clearly annoyed by Diane's sudden aggressive physical assault. He followed her wide-eyed stare and finally looked at the person approaching the glass partition. His eyes widened to the size of saucers. His jaw literally dropped open. For 5 entire years, Frank and Diane had spun a web of comfortable, malicious lies. They had convinced themselves and their wealthy social circle that I was a broken, destitute addict living in the gutters. Confronted with the absolute, undeniable reality of my physical presence in this hospital, his brain simply short-circuited. He could not process the surgical scrubs. He could not comprehend the sheer authority in my stride. His fragile, narcissistic ego desperately searched for an explanation that would keep his distorted, toxic worldview intact. "What are you doing here?" Frank stammered. His voice was entirely stripped of its previous booming, arrogant authority. It sounded thin and reedy. His eyes darted nervously up and down my surgical attire, stopping abruptly on the faint, dark spots of Bridget's blood splattered across my shoes. "Are you cleaning the floors? Did you get a job as a janitor in this hospital?" The profound, staggering stupidity of his question hung heavy in the tense air of the emergency room. I did not even have to open my mouth to answer him. Nurse Martinez, who had been watching this entire hostile exchange with mounting disgust for my parents, stepped forward immediately. She placed her hands firmly on the counter and looked Frank dead in the eyes with a glare that could freeze boiling water. "Sir," Nurse Martinez stated, her voice slicing through the tension like a freshly sharpened scalpel, "you aggressively demanded to speak with the highest-ranking doctor in this facility. You demanded the person directly responsible for saving your daughter's life. I highly suggest you show some respect right now. You are not speaking to a janitor. You are speaking to Dr. Penelope Reed. She is the chief of trauma surgery for this entire medical center, and she is the attending physician currently keeping your daughter breathing." The words hit Frank like a physical blow to the sternum. He actually staggered backward, physically recoiling from the truth as if it burned him. A janitor. That was the only reality his arrogant mind could accept. The thought that the daughter he had violently kicked out into the freezing rain had ascended to the absolute pinnacle of the medical hierarchy was completely incompatible with his ego. He stared at my silver name badge, his eyes tracking the bold black letters over and over again, desperately praying it was some sort of elaborate hallucination. Diane was actively struggling to draw air into her lungs. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, bordering on severe hyperventilation. She looked at the hospital staff, then at me, then back to the staff, frantically searching for anyone to tell her this was a massive administrative mistake. But the nurses, orderlies, and security guards standing nearby only looked at me with absolute unwavering deference. They waited for my orders. They respected my command. I was not a stray dog begging for scraps from their table anymore. I was the apex predator in this concrete jungle. "You," Diane wheezed, pointing a trembling, erratic finger at my chest. "You are the chief surgeon. That is impossible. You dropped out. You are a drug addict. Bridget told us you were destroyed." I stepped right up to the glass partition, closing the distance between us. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, lethal precision of a judge delivering a final, inescapable sentence. "Bridget told you exactly what you wanted to hear, Diane. She fed you a convenient, malicious lie so she could steal your money and fuel her own chemical addictions. And you swallowed that lie whole because it was infinitely easier to throw me away than to actually be a mother. But unfortunately for you, reality does not care about your country club gossip. Reality does not care about your designer dresses or your black credit cards. Reality is what is happening right now behind those doors in Trauma Bay 1. Frank finally found his voice, though it sounded incredibly weak and raspy. He gripped the edge of the intake counter with both hands, trying to physically ground himself as his entire universe capsized. "If you are the surgeon," he croaked, his eyes dropping to my hands, "what did you do to her?" "I did my job, Frank," I replied smoothly, my eyes locking onto his with an intense, unwavering focus. "I just spent the last 20 minutes stabilizing your golden child after she suffered a massive life-threatening seizure caused by a catastrophic illicit drug overdose. I pushed the life-saving medications. I secured her compromised airway. I brought her back from the brink of total cardiac arrest. So before you demand VIP suites and threaten to sue this hospital into bankruptcy, you need to understand one crucial, terrifying fact." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, forcing them to feel the absolute crushing weight of their own helplessness. I watched the terror bloom in their eyes as they finally realized the magnitude of their mistake. "I own this room. I dictate the care. And right now, the only thing standing between Bridget and a body bag is the exact same daughter you threw out like trash." Diane's face contorted into a mask of pure, irrational panic. She let out a piercing shriek that rattled the thick safety glass of the intake partition. She lunged forward, her hands slapping wildly against the counter as if she wanted to smash through it and physically remove me from the premises. "Get away from her!" Diane screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You are trying to kill her! You are doing this on purpose to get back at us. Frank, do not let this psychopath near our baby. She is going to murder Bridget on the operating table and claim it was a medical complication. We need a real doctor. Frank, emboldened by his wife's frantic energy, pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. We demand another physician. I am calling the hospital board of directors. I am calling the police. I will have your medical license revoked and put you behind bars before the night is over. You have a clear conflict of interest, and I absolutely forbid you from touching my daughter. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match their chaotic, undignified screaming. I simply stood there, radiating the absolute chilling calm of a trauma surgeon who has held beating hearts in her bare hands. The ambient noise of the emergency room seemed to fade away, leaving only the sharp clarity of the confrontation. "You do not get to make demands here, Frank," I stated, my tone dropping to a lethal quiet register that forced him to stop yelling just to hear me. "This is not your country club. You cannot buy a different reality. The medical board does not care about your hurt feelings. And the police will be far more interested in the massive quantities of illicit narcotics currently destroying your golden child's internal organs than they will be in your baseless threats." Before Frank could sputter another angry threat, the heavy double doors behind me burst open. A senior surgical resident sprinted out of the red zone, his blue scrub stained with fresh, bright arterial blood. He did not care about the wealthy family causing a scene at the front desk. He only saw his attending physician, and his face was etched with sheer medical panic. "Dr. Reed," the resident shouted, his voice tight with urgency. "The patient in Bay 1 is crashing hard. She has massive internal bleeding from the blunt force trauma she sustained when she collapsed during the seizure on the yacht deck. Her abdomen is completely rigid. We are losing her." I turned my head slightly, my eyes locking onto the large digital monitor mounted above the nurse's station that mirrored the telemetry from the trauma bays. The jagged red and yellow lines tracking Bridget's vital signs were plummeting in real time. The critical alarm bells from the back began to ring with a frantic, high-pitched intensity that signaled impending cardiac arrest. I turned back to my parents. The arrogant defiance had completely vanished from their faces, instantly replaced by the stark, suffocating realization that death was actively knocking on their door. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, stepping closer to the glass, my voice slicing effortlessly through the frantic alarms. "Her blood pressure is 70/40. Her heart rate is rapidly dropping. She is actively bleeding to death from a ruptured spleen caused by her violent drug-induced convulsions." Diane covered her mouth, a choked, agonizing sob escaping her throat. She looked at the flashing red numbers on the monitor, finally understanding that her designer clothes and her high society status were entirely useless against the cold mechanical reality of human mortality. "I am the only fellowship-trained trauma surgeon in this building tonight." I continued delivering the clinical facts with brutal mechanical precision. "If I do not open her abdomen and clamp that bleeding artery in the next 5 minutes, your perfect daughter will bleed out entirely. Her brain will be deprived of oxygen, and she will die on that table before you can even dial the number of your expensive lawyers." Frank's knees literally buckled. He grabbed the edge of the counter with both hands to keep from collapsing onto the floor. His face was gray-slick with a cold, terrified sweat. He looked at me desperately, searching for any trace of the eager-to-please frightened daughter he had discarded 5 years ago. He found absolutely nothing but a terrifying, impenetrable wall of supreme medical authority. "You cannot do this to us," Diane wailed, her legs giving out as she fell to her knees on the sterile linoleum floor. "Please, Penelope, do not let her die. We will pay you anything you want. We will give you whatever you ask for." I looked down at the woman who had returned my wedding invitation, shredded into tiny pieces, the woman who had called me a psychotic dropout. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no familial bond. I only felt the heavy pressing weight of my professional duty. "This is not a negotiation," I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "In this hospital, I am the law. You have exactly 2 options. Either you step aside, shut your mouths, and let me take her into the operating room to save her life right this second, or you can sign a refusal of treatment form, decline my medical care, and carry her corpse back to your foreclosed mansion." I raised my left arm, pulling back the sleeve of my scrubs to reveal my watch. The second hand ticked forward with a loud, rhythmic pulse. The ultimate power dynamic had completely shifted, and I was holding the executioner's axe. "You have exactly 10 seconds to choose," I declared, my eyes burning into Frank's terrified face. 10, 9. "Frank, tell her to do it!" Diane screamed from the floor, frantically grabbing her husband's trousers. "Let her operate. Please God, just save her." 8, 7. I continued the slow, methodical countdown. I wanted them to feel every single second. I wanted them to understand exactly who held the power of life and death over their entire world. 6, 5. The alarms from the trauma bay grew louder, more frantic. The resident standing behind me shifted nervously, his eyes darting between me and the doors, waiting for my signal to rush back in. "Do it!" Frank suddenly gasped, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate sob. He raised his trembling hands in absolute surrender, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. "Save her. Please, Penelope. Save her life. Do whatever you have to do. We agree." 4, I said, letting the number hang in the heavy air just to prove that I controlled the timeline, not him. I dropped my arm. The countdown stopped. I looked at the two broken, pathetic people sobbing on the floor of my emergency room. They had finally been stripped of their wealth, their lies, and their toxic pride. They were nothing but terrified spectators in my domain, entirely at my mercy. "Nurse Martinez," I said without looking away from my parents. "Have him sign the emergency surgical consent forms immediately. If his hand shakes too much to hold the pen, guide it for him." I spun around, my medical clogs gripping the floor as I strode back toward the heavy glass doors of the red zone. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not look back to see them crying. I pushed through the doors and sprinted toward the surgical suite, my mind already calculating the exact incisions required to pull my sister back from the edge of the grave. The time for talking was over. It was time to cut. I saw Frank's hand shaking violently through the thick glass partition as Nurse Martinez shoved the heavy clipboard toward him. The ink smeared across the page in a messy, desperate scrawl, a legally binding signature granting me total, unquestionable control over the life of his precious golden child. I did not stay to watch him weep on the linoleum floor. I pushed through the heavy double doors and headed straight for the scrub sinks. The transition from the screaming chaos of the public waiting room to the icy, sterile silence of the surgical wing was instantaneous. The water ran scalding hot over my hands and forearms as I scrubbed my skin with aggressive, methodical precision. Every single motion was pure muscle memory. The harsh antibacterial soap lathered thick, washing away the lingering memories of the yacht club, leaving behind only the focused, lethal clarity of a trauma surgeon preparing to go to war. I backed through the swinging doors of Operating Room 4 with my hands held high and dripping wet. The room was a freezing, brightly lit theater of highly organized panic. Nurses tore open sterile instrument trays with rapid tearing sounds. Surgical technicians counted sponges and clamped surgical drapes with blazing speed. And standing perfectly still at the head of the operating table, adjusting the complex array of ventilator tubes and intravenous lines, was Caleb. My husband. My absolute anchor. He was wearing his surgical cap and mask, but his eyes locked onto mine the very second I walked into the room. We did not need to speak a single word about the absurd poetic justice of this exact moment. We were two elite medical professionals standing over the broken body of the woman who had tried to destroy us both. Caleb checked the glowing monitors, his voice calm and commanding as he updated me on her rapidly deteriorating hemodynamic status. He had already intubated her, pushing heavy paralytics and powerful induction agents to keep her thrashing body from fighting the life support machines. I stepped up to the surgical table and looked down. The glamorous, cruel bride from the yacht club was completely gone. Bridget lay stripped entirely naked under the harsh, blinding surgical lights. Her skin was painted thick with dark orange iodine prep solution from her chest to her thighs. Her torso was covered in sticky electrocardiogram pads, and thick plastic tubes protruded awkwardly from her mouth and neck. She was no longer the arrogant heiress, throwing wine and barking insults. She was just failing fragile flesh and blood, entirely dependent on my steady hands to survive the next 60 minutes. "Scalpel," I demanded, holding out my right hand without looking away from her abdomen. The scrub technician slapped the cold steel instrument firmly into my waiting palm. I made a swift, deep vertical incision straight down the midline of her stomach, cutting perfectly from just below her sternum, all the way past her navel. The skin parted instantly under the razor-sharp blade. I used the electrocautery tool to burn through the thick layers of yellow subcutaneous fat and tough abdominal fascia. The sharp, acrid smell of searing human tissue quickly filled the sterile air of the operating room. When I breached the peritoneal cavity, dark, heavy blood immediately welled up, overflowing the surgical field and spilling aggressively onto the sterile blue drapes. Suction. I ordered my hands moving with blurring, practiced speed. I plunged my gloved hands directly into the massive pool of blood, blindly navigating the slick, hot internal organs until my fingers finally found the source of the catastrophic hemorrhage. Her spleen had ruptured completely, split nearly in half by the violent blunt force trauma of her head slamming repeatedly against the wooden deck during the seizure. I clamped the splenic artery tight, instantly stopping the lethal bleeding, as the loud suction tube cleared the remaining blood from her abdominal cavity, giving me a clear, unobstructed view of her internal organs. My clinical assessment shifted dramatically. I paused, my bloody hands hovering motionless over the surgical field. The extensive damage I was looking at did not align with a simple physical fall or a standard stress seizure. The tissues of her bowel were pale tight and severely ischemic, suffering from a profound lack of blood flow that had clearly been occurring long before she hit the ground tonight. Her liver was dangerously enlarged and inflamed, mottled with the unmistakable hardened scarring of chronic heavy chemical toxicity. I looked closer at the surrounding vascular structures. The blood vessels were constricted and incredibly brittle, a textbook physiological presentation of prolonged extreme vasoconstriction. This was not just the aftermath of a stressful wedding party. This was the internal rotting wreckage of a profound, catastrophic chemical dependency. I looked up at Caleb across the sterile surgical drape. His eyes narrowed slightly above his blue mask as he read the wildly fluctuating numbers on the anesthesia monitor. "Her core temperature is spiking dangerously high," Caleb stated, his voice tight with acute professional concern. "Her heart rhythm is highly erratic, showing severe ventricular irritability. This extreme hemodynamic instability is not just from the internal blood loss, Penny. Her sympathetic nervous system is completely fried. She is in the middle of a massive, uncontrollable adrenergic storm." The final puzzle pieces locked into place with absolute, terrifying clarity. The wild $2 million financial debt. The erratic, violent mood swings. The sudden foaming collapse on the yacht. Bridget had not just taken a mild sedative to calm her pre-wedding nerves. Her internal organs were being actively cooked alive by a lethal high-dose combination of crystal methamphetamine and powerful synthetic painkillers. The sister who had falsely accused me of severe drug addiction 5 years ago to steal my future was currently dying on my operating table because she was a rampant, uncontrolled, desperate addict herself. I did not feel a single shred of sympathy. I felt the cold, hard, magnificent validation of absolute truth. I looked directly at the circulating nurse standing by the main computer station. "Draw 3 vials of blood right now," I commanded, my voice echoing sharply off the tiled walls. "I want a full, comprehensive toxicology screen run on a stat priority. Screen her specifically for amphetamines, methamphetamines, barbiturates, and heavy synthetic opioids. Do not process this as a standard medical event. This is a severe illicit overdose resulting in catastrophic bodily injury. I want a formal legal report filed with the state authorities and the hospital administration the exact second those lab results hit the system." The nurse nodded immediately, grabbing the plastic vials and rushing toward the intravenous line to extract the blood. Caleb and I locked eyes again over the surgical field. We both knew exactly what that specific legal order meant. A formal hospital-mandated legal toxicology report could not be hidden by Frank and Diane's desperate money. It could not be buried by high-priced defense lawyers or smoothed over with pathetic country club lies. That official document would become a permanent public, undeniable record of Bridget's destructive, fraudulent reality. I turned my attention back to the surgical field, preparing my instruments to physically remove the shattered pieces of her dying spleen. I was absolutely going to save her miserable life today, but I was also going to make absolutely sure that the fake, pristine castle she had built on my suffering would be completely and permanently incinerated by tomorrow morning. The heavy steel doors of Operating Room 4 swung shut behind me, sealing away the sterile cold and the rhythmic beeping of Bridget's life support monitors. I had done exactly what I swore an oath to do. I pulled her shattered body back from the absolute brink of death. Her spleen was removed, the catastrophic internal hemorrhaging was permanently halted, and her vital signs were stabilizing under Caleb's expert command. I walked toward the surgical scrub sinks, stripping off my disposable surgical gown and snapping my blood-soaked latex gloves off my hands. I threw the bloody protective gear into the biohazard bin with a heavy, satisfying thud. As I scrubbed the residual iodine and sweat from my bare forearms, a circulating nurse approached me, holding a thick manila folder. It was the stat laboratory results. The comprehensive toxicology screen and the mandatory full-body trauma scans I had ordered during the operation. I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the bold, black text on the official hospital letterhead. The chemical breakdown was exactly as I had diagnosed, but the pelvic ultrasound results included a secondary finding that made my heart pound with cold, calculated anticipation. It was a secret so destructive, so incredibly toxic, that it was about to incinerate the last remaining shred of the Reed family's fake empire. I closed the folder, my face hardening into a mask of pure clinical detachment, and walked purposefully toward the family consultation room. The private family waiting area outside the surgical intensive care unit was suffocatingly tense. Through the large glass window, I could see Frank and Diane pacing the floor like trapped animals. Their ruined formal wear made them look pathetic under the harsh fluorescent lights. But they were not alone. Sitting rigidly on the expensive leather sofas were the Sinclairs. Preston sat with his head in his hands, his white trousers still bearing the dark stain of the wine Bridget had intentionally thrown at me. His parents stood nearby, their posture radiating absolute freezing fury. Mrs. Sinclair was clutching her designer handbag, her face a mask of elite outrage, clearly demanding an explanation for the humiliating spectacle that had ruined her exclusive yacht club event. When the heavy wooden door clicked open, every single head in the room snapped toward me. Frank took a sudden step forward, his eyes wide with a mixture of desperate hope and profound terror. Diane clamped her hands over her mouth, waiting for the final verdict. Preston stood up slowly, looking at my blue scrubs and the thick medical file I carried under my arm. I walked to the center of the room and stood with my feet firmly planted. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not lower my voice to protect their fragile sensibilities. I spoke with the resonant, unwavering authority of a chief trauma surgeon delivering an official medical briefing. The surgery was successful, I stated clearly, ensuring every person in the room heard every single syllable. The patient suffered a catastrophic splenic rupture resulting in massive internal hemorrhaging. I performed an emergency splenectomy and halted the bleeding. She is currently intubated and resting in the surgical intensive care unit. She is officially out of immediate danger. Frank let out a loud, shuddering gasp of relief, leaning heavily against the painted wall. Diane actually dropped to her knees, sobbing loudly and praising the heavens. However, I continued, my voice slicing right through Diane's theatrical display. My surgical intervention only repaired the physical trauma. We must address the primary physiological catalyst that caused the massive grand mal seizure and subsequent collapse on the yacht club deck. I opened the manila folder and held up the official laboratory report so everyone could see the hospital seal. The comprehensive toxicology screen we ran upon her admission returned highly positive. The patient suffered a severe life-threatening systemic shock due to a massive overdose of crystal methamphetamine and high-yield synthetic opioids. The silence that slammed into the room was absolute and deafening. Diane stopped sobbing instantly, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. Frank turned the color of wet ash. Preston stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck in the chest, his eyes darting frantically between me and his horrifyingly silent parents. Mrs. Sinclair stepped forward, her sharp, calculating eyes locked onto the medical file in my hands. "A drug overdose," the wealthy matriarch repeated, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are telling me the woman my son was supposed to marry is a rampant narcotics addict?" "Yes," I replied smoothly, meeting her gaze without a single ounce of hesitation. "Her internal organ scarring indicates prolonged chronic chemical abuse. But that is not the entirety of the clinical findings." I flipped to the second page of the report, exposing the ultrasound and hematology results. As part of our standard trauma protocol, we performed a full abdominal and pelvic scan to check for additional internal injuries. The imaging, combined with her sharply dropping hormone levels, revealed severe uterine trauma. The patient secretly underwent a medical abortion approximately 2 weeks ago. Based on the severe tissue inflammation and residual chemical toxicity throughout her bloodstream, the termination was likely triggered by severe fetal complications directly caused by her heavy, continuous drug abuse. The air in the private waiting room grew so heavy and stagnant that it felt as though all the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the ventilation system. The horrifying reality of my clinical report hung over the room like a heavy executioner's blade. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. The only sound was the distant rhythmic hum of the hospital machinery bleeding through the walls. I stood perfectly still, holding the manila folder against my chest, watching the absolute destruction of the Reed family's carefully constructed empire unfold in real time. Preston Sinclair was the first to break the suffocating silence. He stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes squeaking awkwardly against the sterile linoleum floor. His face, usually a mask of relaxed, unearned privilege, was now twisted into a horrific portrait of betrayal and disgust. He stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "An abortion?" Preston repeated, his voice cracking violently. He raised a trembling hand to his forehead, running his fingers through his hair. "She told me she lost the baby. She stood in our kitchen crying in my arms and told me she suffered a tragic spontaneous miscarriage. She made me grieve for a child that she intentionally destroyed with a chemical cocktail of illegal narcotics." I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I maintained my rigid professional posture and simply nodded. "The medical evidence is absolutely undeniable," I stated with freezing clarity. "The severe tissue inflammation and the residual concentrations of synthetic opioids in her bloodstream directly align with a deliberate medical termination which was actively precipitated by prolonged severe toxicological distress. She chose the drugs over the pregnancy." The sound that escaped Diane's throat was a pathetic, strangled whimper. She reached out her hands, shaking uncontrollably, trying to grasp the sleeve of Preston's ruined white shirt. "Preston, please," Diane begged, her voice high and erratic. "You have to understand the immense pressure she was under. The wedding planning, the expectations, it all became too much for her fragile nerves. It was just a momentary lapse in judgment. She loves you. She truly loves you." Preston physically recoiled from her touch as if she were coated in highly infectious disease. "Do not dare touch me," he snarled, the raw fury finally breaking through his shock. But it was Mrs. Sinclair who delivered the ultimate devastating blow. The wealthy matriarch stepped forward, her expensive high heels clicking sharply against the hard floor. The polite, restrained indignation she had displayed at the yacht club was completely gone. In its place was the cold, ruthless, terrifying wrath of a billionaire fiercely protecting her bloodline. She walked slowly, methodically toward Diane. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. Diane took a hesitant step backward, sensing the lethal danger radiating from the older woman. "Mrs. Sinclair," Diane stammered, raising her hands in a desperate, placating gesture. "I swear to you, we had absolutely no idea she was using those kinds of substances. We are a respectable family." This is just a horrendous misunderstanding." Mrs. Sinclair did not say a word. She closed the final distance between them, raised her right arm with blistering speed, and slapped Diane across the face with a force so explosive it sounded like a gunshot echoing through the small waiting room. The violent impact snapped Diane's head violently to the side. She let out a sharp cry of pain, stumbling backward and crashing hard into the edge of the heavy leather sofa. She collapsed onto the cushions, clutching her rapidly swelling bright red cheek, completely paralyzed by the sheer shock of the physical assault. Frank gasped, his eyes bulging out of his head. He instinctively stepped toward his wife, but Mrs. Sinclair turned her glacial, murderous gaze directly onto him, freezing him instantly in his tracks. "Do not play the innocent, ignorant victim with me," Mrs. Sinclair hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying, contained rage. "You truly thought you were clever, did you not? You thought you could target my son, an honorable, trusting man, and trick him into marrying a filthy, lying, rampant addict just to scrub your pathetic financial debts clean. You knew your family was drowning in toxic debt. You knew your house was facing immediate foreclosure. And you thought you could use the Sinclair fortune as your personal, desperate bailout fund by anchoring that drug-addicted parasite to my son." Mrs. Sinclair leaned closer to Diane, who was now weeping openly into her hands, completely shattered and humiliated. "The engagement is permanently canceled," the matriarch declared, pronouncing each word with the finality of a judge dropping a gavel. "The wedding is off. There will be no merger of our families. There will be no celebration. You will never speak to my son again, and you will never set foot anywhere near our properties." She turned her fierce attention back to Frank, who was sweating profusely, his face pale and sickly under the fluorescent lights. "And regarding that $500,000 down payment we so generously provided for the new condominium," Mrs. Sinclair continued, her tone dripping with absolute venom, "I suggest you find a way to retrieve it from whatever fraudulent digital currency account your precious daughter wired it to. Because by 8 o'clock on Monday morning, our corporate attorneys will be filing a massive, relentless lawsuit against every single member of your family. We will sue you for gross misrepresentation, severe emotional distress, and criminal financial fraud. We will strip you down to your very last penny, and we will make sure every elite circle in this city knows exactly what kind of desperate lying scam artists you truly are." Total panic erupted behind Frank's eyes. The complete, unmitigated destruction of his precious social status and his entire financial future was happening right in front of him. He completely lost whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left. The arrogant, boastful patriarch from the yacht club was dead. In his place was a desperate, pathetic man terrified of losing everything. "Wait, please, Frank," begged, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. He lunged forward, throwing his hands out in a frantic attempt to grab Mr. Sinclair's jacket lapels. "Please, Richard, we can fix this. I can explain everything. I will pay you back every single cent. Just give us a chance to make this right. Do not destroy us." Frank never even made contact with the billionaire's jacket. The two massive, broad-shouldered private security guards who had been standing silently by the door sprang into action with terrifying, brutal efficiency. The lead bodyguard stepped smoothly in front of Mr. Sinclair, his heavy hand shooting out to intercept Frank's desperate lunge. He grabbed Frank by the front of his torn, ruined tuxedo shirt, twisted the fabric tightly, and effortlessly hurled my father backward. Frank flew through the air, his dress shoes slipping completely out from under him. He hit the hard linoleum floor with a heavy, sickening thud, sliding several feet until his back slammed violently against the base of the receptionist's desk. He lay there, groaning in pain, completely humiliated and physically broken, staring up at the ceiling in absolute defeat. The lead bodyguard adjusted his dark suit jacket, not even breathing heavily. "Do not attempt to touch Mr. Sinclair again," the guard stated in a low, dangerous rumble, "or the next time you hit the floor, you will not be waking up." Mr. Sinclair wrapped a protective arm around his wife's shoulders. He looked down at Frank writhing on the floor with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Let us go," Mr. Sinclair said calmly. "The stench of this family is making me physically ill. I do not want to spend another single second breathing the same air as these pathetic criminals." Preston gave one final horrified look toward the surgical intensive care unit where Bridget was lying, then turned his back on the Reed family forever. The Sinclairs walked out of the private waiting room in a tight, impenetrable formation, their heavy security detail following closely behind them. The heavy wooden door swung shut, clicking loudly, sealing my parents inside the room with the catastrophic wreckage of their own making. I stood perfectly still, watching Frank clutching his bruised back on the floor, and Diane weeping hysterically into the leather sofa. I had not laid a single finger on either of them. I had not yelled. I had not thrown a single insult. All I had done was stand firmly in my position of absolute authority and deliver the undeniable clinical truth. And the truth alone had been more than enough to burn their entire fake toxic empire straight down to the ashes. The rhythmic, mechanical chirp of the heart monitor was the only sound in the sterile confines of the surgical intensive care unit. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the hum of high-end ventilation systems. I stood at the foot of the bed, my white chief of surgery coat crisp and bright under the shadowless LED lights. I didn't look like the daughter who had slept in her car 5 years ago. I looked like the authority that everyone in this building answered to. Bridget's eyes began to flicker under her heavy, drug-swollen lids. Her breathing changed, catching against the tube that had only been removed an hour prior. Slowly, the world came back to her. She blinked, squinting against the harsh fluorescent glare, and then her gaze landed on me. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the monitor began to race. The heart rate on the screen jumped from 80 to 100, then 110. Recognition flooded her face, followed immediately by a sharp, jagged spike of malice. She tried to sit up, but her abdominal muscles, recently sliced and stapled back together, betrayed her. She let out a strangled, raspy groan of pain. "You!" she hissed, her voice sounding like glass grinding against stone. "Get away from me! Where are Mom and Dad? You did this, didn't you? You messed with my surgery!" She tried to reach for the call button, her hand shaking violently, her skin still tinged with the yellow of liver distress. I watched her struggle without moving a muscle to help. I remained a pillar of clinical ice. "Help!" She started to croak, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to summon the nurses. "Help me! This woman is trying to kill me. She is not a doctor. She is a fraud. Somebody get her out of here before she finishes the job." I didn't call for security. I didn't try to quiet her down. I simply reached into the deep pocket of my white coat and pulled out 2 sets of documents. I stepped closer to the bed, the heels of my shoes clicking with a sound of absolute finality on the floor. "Save your breath, Bridget," I said, my voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of a death sentence. "The nurses aren't coming to save you from me. In this hospital, I am the one who gives the orders. Every single person in this unit knows exactly who I am, and more importantly, they know exactly who you are." Bridget's eyes darted to my name badge, then back to my face. Her panic was turning into a frantic, ugly search for a new lie. I did not give her the time to find one. I held up the first document, the official stat toxicology report from the lab. I didn't hand it to her. I dropped it directly onto her chest, right over her surgical bandages. "That is your blood work," I stated. "It shows a lethal concentration of crystal meth and synthetic opioids. It shows a systemic chemical rot that has been eating your organs from the inside out for years. This isn't just a pre-wedding mistake, Bridget. This is a criminal record. Because you were admitted with a catastrophic overdose, resulting in a life-threatening trauma, this report has already been automatically uploaded to the state database. The police have already flagged your file." Bridget looked at the paper, her hands trembling as she tried to push it away. "You faked that," she managed to sputter. "You are trying to frame me again. Mom and Dad will never believe you. They know I am the good daughter. They know you are the addict." I smiled, a thin, dangerous expression. "They already saw it, Bridget. I read the results to them in the consultation room right in front of the Sinclairs. Your perfect little merger is dead. The Sinclairs left an hour ago after their security guard threw Dad across the lobby for trying to beg them for money. Preston Sinclair knows about the drugs. He knows about the hidden medical abortion you had 2 ago. He knows everything." Bridget's face went a sickly shade of gray. Her mouth opened and closed, but no lies came out. The silence in the room was deafening as she realized the golden pedestal she had lived on for 31 years had finally crumbled into the dirt. But I wasn't finished. I held up the second document, a thick stack of billing statements, with the hospital's financial seal at the top. I dropped this one on top of the first right onto her lap. Now let's talk about your future, I said, leaning down so my face was only inches from hers. Because of the nature of your admission, the insurance company was required to do a manual review of your eligibility. It turns out that when a policyholder forges signatures on mortgage documents and defaults on high-interest loans, their credit score takes a dive that triggers a secondary verification of their premiums. Your Elite Health Insurance was canceled 3 days ago for non-payment. Bridget grabbed the billing statement, her eyes scanning the bottom line. The number was printed in bold, uncompromising black ink. $120,000. That includes the trauma team, activation, the emergency operating room, fees, the 3 units of rare blood products we had to pump into you to keep you from flatlining, and your stay in this high-intensity unit, I explained. And since you are no longer covered, and since Dad's estate is currently in the middle of a foreclosure proceeding, that you caused the hospital is going to require a personal guarantee for payment before you are discharged. I don't have that kind of money, Bridget whispered, her arrogance finally replaced by a raw, naked terror. You have to help me. You're my sister. You're a doctor. You can't just leave me with this. I stood back up, adjusting the lapels of my coat. My eyes were as cold as the surgical steel I had used to save her life. You're right, Bridget. I am a doctor, and I did my job. I saved your life. That was my only obligation to you, and I have fulfilled it. But as for being your sister, that ended the night you watched me walk out into the rain with nothing but a bag of books, while you toasted your victory with a glass of wine. I turned toward the door, not waiting for her response. I could hear the monitor start to beep frantically again as she began to hyperventilate. Mom and Dad are waiting in the hallway, I said over my shoulder. They have some very interesting things to say to you about the forged mortgage, but I wouldn't count on them for a loan. Last I heard, they were looking for a 2-bedroom apartment in a part of town you wouldn't be caught dead in. I pushed the heavy door open, the sound of her first genuine scream of despair echoing behind me. I stepped out into the hallway, feeling the weight of the past 5 years finally lift. The medical bill was hers. The shame was hers. The consequences were finally where they belonged. I walked toward the elevators, ready to go home to Caleb, leaving the ruins of the Reed family exactly where I found them, in the cold, unforgiving light of the truth. Happy paying Bridget. I stepped out of the intensive care unit, the heavy mechanical doors sealing Bridget and her frantic, desperate sobbing behind me. I wanted nothing more than to walk to the elevators, leave the hospital, and go home to my peaceful life. But my path was immediately blocked. Frank and Diane were charging down the sterile corridor toward me. They looked completely unhinged. Diane's ruined designer gown flapped around her ankles, and Frank's face was contorted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. They had just watched the Sinclair family, their billionaire ticket out of debt, walk out the hospital doors in utter disgust. They needed a punching bag. They needed their traditional scapegoat to bear the weight of their own catastrophic failures. "You malicious, vindictive monster!" Diane shrieked, her voice echoing harshly off the hospital walls. She lunged forward, raising her hand as if she might actually try to strike me right there in the surgical wing. "You ruined everything. You violated federal privacy laws. You had absolutely no right to read her private medical records to the Sinclair family. We are going to sue you for every single penny you have and have your medical license permanently revoked." Frank stepped up beside her, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned stark white. "You broke the law, Penelope. Privacy regulations protect patients from vindictive, jealous doctors. You just handed us the exact ammunition we need to destroy your career. I will personally see you dragged into federal court and stripped of everything you have built." Before I even had to open my mouth to defend my clinical actions, a tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped smoothly between me and my furious parents. It was Caleb. He had changed out of his surgical scrubs and was now wearing a sharp, tailored suit, looking every inch the elite medical attorney he was. He did not raise his voice. He did not display an ounce of intimidation. He simply reached into his breast pocket and produced his official State Bar Association credential, holding it up so the harsh fluorescent light caught the gold seal. Actually, Frank, my wife followed the letter of the law with absolute flawless precision. Caleb stated, his voice radiating cold, unyielding legal authority. I am Dr. Reed's legal counsel, and I can assure you that there is zero privacy violation here. When a patient is admitted to a Level 1 trauma center with a catastrophic injury directly caused by a massive illicit narcotics overdose, the attending physician is legally mandated to file a formal toxicology report with the state. Furthermore, you explicitly demanded a full medical briefing in the presence of the Sinclair family. You gave verbal witnessed consent for that information to be shared in that room. You built the gallows, Frank. My wife simply pulled the lever. Diane opened her mouth to argue, but the sound died completely in her throat. Caleb was not finished. But your daughter's medical records are the absolute least of your concerns right now, Caleb continued, reaching into his other pocket and pulling out his smartphone. Because, as a courtesy to my wife, I had my financial investigation team look into the sudden frantic activity surrounding your primary residential estate. I received a very interesting update while Penny was in the operating room. Caleb tapped the screen a few times and pressed the speakerphone button. He held the device up so the audio would project clearly into the quiet hospital corridor. The voice of a frantic, highly stressed real estate broker filled the air. Mr. Reed, this is Harrison from the Executive Banking Division. The voice crackled through the speaker, tight with professional panic. I have been trying to reach you all night. The bank initiated a full aggressive foreclosure on your Beacon Hill estate at 8 o'clock this morning. Federal marshals have already secured the perimeter of the property and changed all the locks. Frank's face went completely slack. The aggressive, arrogant posture he had maintained for decades vanished in a single second. His entire body trembled as he stared at the glowing phone. Foreclosure. Frank choked out his voice, barely a raspy whisper. That is impossible. My house is fully paid off. I own it free and clear. Not anymore, Frank Caleb replied smoothly, looking down at the broken man. Your golden child saw to that. Let him hear the rest, Harrison. The broker's voice continued, delivering the final fatal blows to their fake empire. Sir, the secondary mortgage that was taken out 6 months ago went into catastrophic default. The loan was for $1.5 million. Our fraud department reviewed the digital signatures this afternoon. Bridget Reed bypassed your security protocols, forged your authorization, and funneled the entire lump sum into an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange. The market crashed, and those funds were completely liquidated. Worse, she used the remaining equity to secure high-yield loans from unregulated predatory lenders to cover her massive synthetic narcotic purchases. The estate is gone, Mr. Reed. The bank seized it to cover the toxic debt. You have absolutely no assets left. Caleb ended the call. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and utterly magnificent. The illusion of the wealthy, untouchable Reed family completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the linoleum floor. The grand sandcastle they had built on a foundation of lies, and my suffering had just been washed away by a tidal wave of truth. Diane let out a hollow, agonizing gasp. Her knees buckled instantly. She collapsed against the corridor wall, sliding down until she hit the floor in a heap of ruined designer fabric. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, rocking back and forth as the horrifying reality finally set in. She was not a wealthy socialite anymore. She was not the envy of the country club. She was homeless, destitute, and publicly disgraced. Her beloved daughter had not just embarrassed them, she had robbed them blind and left them to drown. Frank staggered backward, clutching his chest as if he were having a genuine cardiac event. He looked through the large glass window into the intensive care unit where Bridget lay, surrounded by expensive medical equipment. The daughter he had worshipped, the daughter he had chosen over me, had systematically destroyed his entire financial legacy. She had traded their mansion for digital coins and illegal pills. He had thrown away a brilliant trauma surgeon to protect a parasitic thief. I stood beside my husband, watching the absolute destruction of my abusers. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I felt only the clean, sharp satisfaction of absolute justice. They had finally received exactly what they deserved. The silence in the corridor was absolute, broken only by the ragged, uneven gasping coming from the floor. Diane was completely crumpled against the baseboards. The reality of her new existence was crushing the breath right out of her lungs. Frank stood paralyzed, staring at the blank screen of Caleb's phone as if he could somehow magically reverse the call and undo the catastrophic damage. They were entirely stripped of their arrogant armor. The country club memberships, the lavish dinner parties, the quiet, smug superiority they had wielded like a weapon against me for my entire life, were all completely obliterated. Then a new realization dawned on Frank's pale, sweating face. His eyes slowly shifted from the phone in Caleb's hand to the heavy sealed doors of the intensive care unit, and finally, they locked onto me. I could see the exact moment his brain calculated the inescapable math of their situation. The Sinclairs had taken their millions and walked away. The bank had seized their sprawling estate. Their credit was completely destroyed by Bridget's fraudulent loans. And lying in that hospital bed, requiring weeks of expensive intensive care, was a daughter without a single shred of health insurance. Frank took a trembling step forward. His knees simply gave out. The proud, unyielding patriarch of the Reed family collapsed onto the sterile linoleum floor right in front of me. Diane let out a fresh, agonizing sob and crawled over to join him. They were both on their knees, completely abandoning whatever tiny fraction of dignity they had left. Diane reached out with shaking hands and actually grabbed the fabric of my blue surgical scrubs. Her tears soaked the knees of my pants. She looked up at me, her face completely ruined by running mascara and sheer unfiltered terror. "Penelope, please!" Diane wailed, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "You have to help us. You are the only one left. The house is gone. The money is gone. We have absolutely nothing. How are we supposed to survive this? How are we supposed to pay for her hospital bills? You heard the charges. We will be living on the streets." Frank reached out and gripped the hem of my surgical coat, his fingers trembling violently. "You are my daughter," Frank begged, his voice reduced to a pathetic, rattling whisper. "You are a chief surgeon. You are married to a successful lawyer. You are making millions of dollars now. This hospital bill is pocket change to you. You can easily clear this debt. You can buy us a small place to live. Please, Penelope, you cannot just leave your own flesh and blood to rot in the gutter. We are begging you. Have some mercy." I looked down at the two people kneeling at my feet. I looked at the hands gripping my clothes, the same hands that had violently shoved me out of my childhood home into the freezing rain. I remembered the hunger. I remembered the crippling exhaustion. I remembered the predatory student loans and the nights I spent crying in a hospital linen closet because I had absolutely nobody in the entire world to call for help. I did not feel a single ounce of mercy. I calmly reached down and took Diane's wrists, peeling her manicured fingers off my surgical scrubs with firm, clinical detachment. I did the same to Frank, stepping back so they could no longer touch me. I stood tall, looking down at them with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. 5 years ago, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute crystalline clarity through the quiet hospital corridor. You stood in a warm, beautiful hallway and watched me pack my entire life into a single canvas bag. You took my car, you drained my savings, you slapped me across the face and told me to get out. Diane let out a choked sob, trying to reach for me again, but Caleb stepped forward, blocking her path entirely. "Do you remember your exact words that night, Mother?" I asked, my tone dropping to a lethal quiet register. "Because I remember them perfectly. They kept me awake for years. You told me to never send my trash to your house. You told me not to bother you with my miserable failures." Frank closed his eyes, fresh tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks as the weight of his own cruelty finally crashed down upon him. "Now I am returning those exact words to you," I declared, sealing their fate with absolute finality. "Bridget is your golden child. You chose her. You protected her. You believed her lies over my truth. Therefore, her medical bills, her drug debts, and her catastrophic failures belong entirely to you. You can carry that crushing weight all by yourselves. I will not pay a single cent toward her recovery. I will not give you a dime for a new home. You wanted a life without me, and now you finally have it. Good luck finding a comfortable cardboard box in the slums. I turned my back on them. I did not need to say another word. I slipped my arm through Caleb's, feeling the solid, unwavering warmth of the man who had stood by me when I had absolutely nothing. We began to walk down the long, brightly lit corridor of the surgical wing. Behind me, the chaotic, desperate wailing of my parents filled the air, a pathetic symphony of complete and utter ruin. They were weeping for the mansion they had lost, the wealthy in-laws they had alienated, and the brilliant, successful daughter they had thrown away. Their cries echoed off the sterile walls, but the sound simply washed over me, entirely powerless to pull me back into their toxic gravity. As I walked past the nurses' station, the chaotic energy of the emergency department seemed to pause. The surgical residents I had trained, the trauma nurses who had fought beside me in the trenches, and the administrative staff who ran the floor, all stopped what they were doing. They did not look at the screaming people on the floor. They looked at me. One by one, they stepped aside, clearing a path. They nodded their heads in silent, profound respect for their chief of surgery. I walked through the automatic sliding glass doors and stepped out into the cool, refreshing night air. The heavy, suffocating chains of my past completely shattered and fell away. I looked up at the vast star-filled sky, feeling a profound, untouchable peace settle deep inside my chest. I had not laid a hand on them. I had not broken a single law. I had simply stepped out of their way and allowed their own toxic arrogance to destroy them. The absolute greatest revenge was not an act of violence. It was simply standing in the light, completely unbothered, and living a brilliantly successful life without them. The most powerful lesson to take away from Penny's harrowing yet triumphant journey is this: you cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and you are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic family members warm. For years, Penny was subjected to the cruelest form of conditional love. Her parents demanded perfection and absolute obedience. Yet they instantly discarded her the moment she became a threat to their carefully curated social image. Society often conditions us to believe that blood is thicker than water, implying that we must endure endless abuse simply because we share DNA with our abusers. However, this story shatters that dangerous and manipulative myth. It teaches us that true family is built on mutual respect, unwavering support, and honesty, not manipulation, financial exploitation, and deceit. Penny's ultimate victory did not come from screaming matches or actively plotting her family's financial ruin. Her sweetest revenge was entirely passive, yet devastatingly effective. She won the exact moment she stopped seeking validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. By redirecting all her pain, rejection, and trauma into her own education and medical career, she forged an undeniable empire of her own making. She simply stepped out of their toxic orbit and allowed the natural, catastrophic consequences of their own lies, addiction, and arrogance to finally catch up with them. The lesson is crystal clear. Your worth is not determined by the people who are blindly committed to misunderstanding you. Sometimes walking away is not an act of surrender. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation and empowerment. You have the absolute right to protect your peace. Have you ever had to establish firm boundaries with a toxic family member to protect your own future? Share your story of resilience in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more empowering journeys of reclaiming your life.